Nobody builds a research base in Antarctica by accident. It is the most hostile environment on the planet. No indigenous population, no infrastructure, no supply chain that does not require months of planning and significant resources to maintain. Getting there is difficult. Staying there is harder. Running a scientific research operation there, one large enough to require a dig site described as uncommonly large for a research expedition, requires the kind of institutional commitment that does not happen casually. Someone built that base before Moorcroft arrived, and when Operation Deep Freeze tracked Dr. Emmanuel Moorcroft, Horzine's chief scientist, who believed the mire represented the next step in human evolution, to the Brunt Ice Shelf in March 2026, the base he was using was not something he had constructed. It was abandoned, already there, already equipped with infrastructure large enough to support the most significant extra-dimensional experiments the franchise has ever described. Someone built it, left it, and Moorcroft found it. That detail is the starting point for everything this video is going to cover. What Moorcroft was actually doing in Antarctica, why the Brunt Ice Shelf specifically, what the abandoned base's history might tell us about who else knew what he was looking for, what the extra-dimensional experiments actually produced, and why the rift he opened at the bottom of the world is the most dangerous unresolved thread in the entire Killing Floor 3-story heading into Year 2. If you have never played any of the games or watched any previous video in this series, everything gets explained as we go. Let's get into it. To understand why Antarctica matters, you need to understand where Moorcroft's story was when Season 3 began. Killing Floor 3 launched with Moorcroft already deep into his mire research, running experiments on living subjects inside Horzine's most restricted division, a classified operation he had founded himself called the R and D Red Division, producing creatures that the franchise classifies as a completely separate category from the bioengineered Zeds Horzine had been making for decades. Not Zeds, mire entities. Things that emerge from or connected to the mire itself rather than being produced by applying Horzine's genetic modification technology to existing biology. Nightfall had been tracking him across seasons 1 and 2. Each season the stakes got higher. Each new creature Moorcroft produced was more advanced than the last. The Scavenger, the Queen Crawler, the Impaler, the Chimera. Each one a signal that wherever this research was heading, it was getting there faster than anyone could stop it. By the time Season 3 arrived in March 2026, the trail had gone cold in one direction and blazingly obvious in another. Moorcroft had gone to Antarctica, the Brunt Ice Shelf, one of the most remote locations on the planet, a place where the nearest human settlement is hundreds of miles away, where the weather makes outdoor work dangerous for most of the year, where maintaining any kind of research operation requires resources that most organizations simply do not have, and where an abandoned scientific research base with an attached dig site was already waiting for him. The abandoned base is the detail that most people walked past in Season 3 without thinking about what it actually meant. Two things stand out about it specifically. The base is abandoned, and the dig site attached to it is uncommonly large for a research expedition. Abandoned means it was built and then left, not destroyed, not decommissioned through normal institutional channels. Left with infrastructure intact enough that Moorcroft could move in and use it as the base for his most sensitive experiments, with whatever equipment and records and physical remnants of the previous operation still present inside it. And the dig site being uncommonly large is the detail that really gets me when I think about it. Antarctic research bases are expensive to build and even more expensive to maintain. Every meter of excavation in that environment costs significantly more than it would anywhere else on Earth. You do not go that deep in that environment unless you have a very specific reason to be looking for something down there. Someone was looking for something specific enough to justify that scale of excavation in one of the most inaccessible places on Earth. We now know the mire exists at geological depth in locations accessible to drilling operations. The North Sea oil rig proved that, which means the Antarctic base was almost certainly built by someone who knew the mire was accessible at that depth in that specific location on the Brunt Ice Shelf. They went to one of the most remote places on the planet to find it, and then left without finishing what they came for. Who built the base is a question the franchise has not confirmed, and honestly, it might be the most interesting question this whole Antarctic story raises. When you think about what the operation required, resources, secrecy, specific knowledge of where the mire could be accessed at geological depth in one of the world's most inaccessible locations. The list of organizations that could have pulled that off quietly in 2091 is pretty short. Horzine is the most obvious candidate, a corporation with the resources, the institutional secrecy, and the specific interest in biological anomalies that would make a classified Antarctic mire excavation make sense. Moorcroft, finding an abandoned Horzine facility, rather than building his own, would explain why he could set up operations there so quickly and why the infrastructure was sufficient for the experiments he needed to run. But then there is the lone mercenary. When nightfall arrived at the Antarctic base, they discovered they were not alone. Another operative was already there, tracking Moorcroft independently, operating outside any official organizational framework. Someone who had arrived at the most remote research location in the franchise's lore without any connection to Nightfall and without being sent by Horzine. Nightfall formed an uneasy alliance with them to stop Moorcroft, but the franchise never explained who that person actually was, what organization or motivation had sent them there, whether they knew about the mire and the base before arriving or were following Moorcroft's trail the same way Nightfall was, whether their presence at that specific location was connected to whoever originally built the facility Moorcroft was using. That is a thread the franchise left deliberately open, and the person at the end of that thread knows something the rest of the story has not revealed yet. What Moorcroft was doing in that base is what Operation Deep Freeze describes as extradimensional experiments. That word appeared for the first time in the franchise's history in Season 3. And it is worth sitting with how significant that actually is. Every experiment Horzine had run across 3 games up to that point was biological. Genetic modification, cloning, enhancement of existing life forms that pushed past ethical and scientific limits, but that ultimately still operated within the world we know. Extradimensional is something else entirely. It means Moorcroft was working with something that does not play by the rules of conventional biology or conventional physics, something that exists beyond the physical reality that all of Horzine's previous research was embedded in, not just pushing the limits of what science understood, operating somewhere outside of those limits entirely. And the mission objective for Season 3 was to get there and force these experiments to an early conclusion before Moorcroft became unstoppable. Force them to an early conclusion, not destroy the facility, not shut everything down cleanly. Force something that was already in progress to stop before it reached its intended endpoint, which means by the time Nightfall arrived, whatever Moorcroft was doing down there already had momentum. Something was already happening that required active intervention to interrupt. Something was already in the process of opening when Nightfall arrived. And forcing an experiment to an early conclusion is not the same as undoing what it had already done. The Alpha Scavenger is the clearest evidence of what that process was producing. Season 3 introduced the Alpha Scavenger as the first new boss in the franchise since killing Floor 3 launched. And the Alpha Scavenger is not a creature Moorcroft engineered in a conventional laboratory. It is something that emerged from the Antarctic dig site environment itself. The Scavenger is a mire creature, a pack-hunting entity that cannibalizes its own dead to grow stronger. The Alpha variant is the most advanced expression of whatever the mire produces when it has maximum access to the surface. An underground dig site at the Brunt Ice Shelf, an unnaturally large excavation that gave the mire direct exposure to the surface through the layers of ice and rock above it, a facility running extra-dimensional experiments that were actively in progress. The most powerful mire creature the franchise had introduced at that point emerged from that environment. Not from a lab, not from a genetic engineering program, from the conditions Moorcroft's experiments had created in that dig site. Which means by the time nightfall arrived in Antarctica, whatever Moorcroft was doing down there had already progressed far enough to produce something the franchise had never seen before. The dig site was not just a location for his research, it was responding to what he was doing inside it. And here's where the Antarctic Rift enters the story, and where the most important unresolved question in Killing Floor 3 becomes clear. Season 4's description of Moorcroft's goal on the oil rig is to open an even larger rift into the Dreadzone. An even larger rift. Think about what that phrasing is actually telling you. You do not describe something as even larger without implying something smaller already exists to compare it to. That is not an accident. That is the franchise confirming that Moorcroft had already opened a first rift somewhere before the oil rig, and the most logical location for that smaller first rift is exactly where his most advanced extra-dimensional experiments were actively running when nightfall interrupted them. The Antarctic dig site. If Moorcroft opened a first connection to the Dreadzone anywhere it was there, in an unnaturally large excavation above a natural mire deposit, running experiments that were already producing the most powerful mire creature yet seen, in a facility that someone else had already built to access the same thing he was looking for. That is where the barrier between this world and the Dreadzone was thinnest. That is where the first contact happened, and forcing those experiments to an early conclusion is not the same as closing a rift. Nightfall interrupted the process. They stopped it before it reached what Moorcroft intended. But interrupting an opening is not the same as sealing it. A rift that was partially established when the experiments were forced to stop is not necessarily a rift that no longer exists. The Antarctic rift may still be open, smaller than what Moorcroft eventually tried to create on the oil rig, but a connection nonetheless. A first contact point between this world and the Dreadzone that the franchise has never officially confirmed was closed. What came through that first rift is the question that connects Antarctica to everything Season 4 revealed about Moorcroft's transformation. He merged with his own experiments, became what the game calls the ultimate doomsday weapon, and the language used to describe that choice is telling. After his experiments failed to stop Nightfall's pursuit, he decided to handle things directly. Handle things directly, not sacrifice himself, not make a desperate last move out of desperation. Handle things. A tactical decision made by a man who still believed he was in control of a situation that had been escalating for a year. A man who had already opened a rift to the Dreadzone in Antarctica, who had seen what was on the other side of that initial connection, who had experienced whatever the Dreadzone sent through that first smaller opening at the bottom of the world, and who decided, after all of that, that becoming a mire-merged doomsday weapon was the right next step. Whatever Moorcroft saw through that Antarctic rift did not frighten him into desperation. It convinced him that the Dreadzone was worth everything it cost to reach, that merging with his own experiments was not an ending, but a progression, that the thing he was becoming was closer to what the Dreadzone contained than what he had been before. He had seen something on the other side that made his own transformation feel like moving in the right direction. And whatever that something was has not gone away just because Moorcroft is gone. The Antarctic rift is still unaccounted for. The franchise confirmed the Dreadzone exists. It confirmed the mire exists naturally at geological depth in multiple locations around the world. It confirmed that Moorcroft's extra-dimensional experiments in Antarctica were the first serious attempt to connect this world to whatever lies beyond the barrier between dimensions. But here's what it never confirmed, that the rift was closed. Nightfall forced the experiments to an early conclusion. They interrupted what was happening, But nobody in the franchise has officially said the connection that Moorcroft opened in that Antarctic dig site was sealed, destroyed, or dealt with in any meaningful way after Season 3 ended. At the bottom of the world, in an abandoned research base that someone built and left before Moorcroft ever arrived, a dig site that was uncommonly large for any legitimate research purpose opens into the earth above a mire deposit. And somewhere in that dig site, in the darkness below the Antarctic ice, a rift that nobody confirmed was closed is sitting in the most remote location on the planet. Nobody is watching it. Nothing in Season 4 addressed it, and whatever was pressing against the barrier from the Dreadzone side did not stop pressing just because the scientist who was helping it through decided to move his operation to an oil rig in the North Sea. Year 2 of Killing Floor 3 is coming, and the abandoned research base on the Brunt Ice Shelf, with its uncommonly large dig site and its unconfirmed rift, is still sitting there, waiting. That is what Moorcroft found in Antarctica, not just a remote location to hide his experiments, an abandoned facility that someone else had already built to access the same thing he was looking for, a dig site large enough to expose the mire at geological depth. A first connection to the Dreadzone that the franchise never confirmed was closed, and a glimpse of whatever the Dreadzone contains that convinced him everything that followed was worth it. Subscribe so you do not miss what Year 2 reveals, because if Tripwire returns to Antarctica and answers the question of who built that base and what the rift's current status actually is, everything we thought we understood about the mire's history in this world is going to change significantly. And drop a comment. The abandoned base was built by someone before Moorcroft arrived, someone with the resources and the knowledge to go to one of the most remote places on Earth and excavate an unnaturally large dig site above a mire deposit. Who do you think built it? Because that question is the one I keep coming back to. And I genuinely think the answer to it might be the most important setup for everything Year 2 is about to tell us. Tell me what you think.